When you first receive the swivel mount for the Twin Turbo Vise, it looks like this. And I need to give you instructions so that you can set it up and get it installed so that it looks and works like this. So here we go. And by here we go, I mean you should shut this video off because it's boring as sin unless you actually really need to know how to install the swivel vise. Seriously, it's boring. Still here, huh? Alright, let's do it. The first thing to do is to use these mounting plates to lay out the mounting holes on the underside of your workbench. And the key to doing this is understanding that the outside edges of these mounting plates is 2 5/16 inch larger than the nominal size of your bench. So for example, this is set up for the 14-inch vise. 14 plus 2 5/16 is obviously 16 5/16, so that's what you end up with. Same thing for the 20-inch and the 24-inch vises. And for the irritated metric folks, 59 millimeters is close enough to 2 5/16. You can just use that. So to get the mount centered on the end of a bench, you take that separation between the two edges of the mounting plates. You subtract that number from the total width of your bench, and you divide by 2 for the offset from the edge, and you use that in a square to set up one of the mounting plates in place where it needs to be. And I'd recommend securing it with a clamp in a place where you're not covering any of the small countersunk holes or slots, because that's what you're laying out here. Now, having located all of those holes and slots, I use an awl to put a point right in their centers and then drill an 1/8 inch hole for each of them. Now, you may have noticed that I also marked the square hole right in the center of the mounting plate, and that's because at that point I need to drill about a 1-inch diameter hole, 1/4 of an inch deep. This makes room for the carriage bolt that is what is used to tighten the plates in place when you don't want the swivel functionality, or when you want to lock it in place for a particular swivel. So the mounting holes are done. Well, one side is. Do the other side just like this, and then you're ready for the next step. And the next step involves actually assembling each of the swivel mount sides, and for that you will need these pictures of the specific setup for your vise size. All 3 sizes are different. You can download these for free on my website. There's a link in the description. What you're looking at here is the 14-inch vise. It's a different setup for the 20-inch vise and the 24-inch vise. So pay close attention to these, and I'm going to take you through a few things to look for specifically right now. So we're back to the 14-inch vise. Now, the first thing to notice is that the mounting plates are not symmetric front and back. Now, I didn't mention this before when we were laying out holes because for the purposes of the small countersunk holes, they are symmetric, so it didn't matter which orientation you had them. But now it does. Notice that these inner mounting patterns on the large countersunk holes are different, and it's important that you orient them correctly front to back. Obviously in this picture, front is on the top, and you can see the pattern of the holes on front and back is different. So as long as the fronts of the mounting plates, which is not so obvious and needs to be determined from this picture, matches up with the fronts of the brown traveling plates, which is much more obvious. The front is the side with 2 mounting holes for the big screw bushing at the front of it, then you're good. Now we have to set up the green pivot bars in their proper location, and they are mounted on the mounting plates in the center differently for each vise, and also their orientation and position is different for each size of vise. So each side gets a mounting bar with a little nub out of it and a very slight bend to it, and another one without any nub out of it and a more significant bend. And you set it up just like it's shown in the pictures. Take some time to make sure you get this right. And the first thing to do is to mount them on the brown traveling plates. Now to do this, you use 4 5/16 inch screws. The tool comes with 8 that are relatively short, but 4 of those 8 are a little shorter than the other 4. Those are what you want for this. You also need 4 spacers and 4 of these nuts. You tighten it all down, and once you do, the pivot arm should be moving freely. If it doesn't move freely, what's happening is that the nut is tightening down on the pivot bar itself and not the little spacer. I cut it kind of close on the tolerances. I think most of them will be fine, but some of you might find that you just need to sand down the edges of the nut just a little bit. Takes a second, and if you do this, then you should be able to tighten it down and have that pivot arm traveling without any friction. And a little bit of oil right around that spacer bushing before you put the nut on is probably a good idea. So with both arms fixed to the traveling plates in the correct orientation shown by the pictures, you're ready to connect the other end of the pivot arms to the mounting plate. And for that, you're going to use these larger spacers, slightly longer screws, and the same nuts. And after they're all good and tightened down, the traveling plate should still be able to pivot and travel with relatively low friction. Now it's time to use these longer screws to secure the nut and bushing for the Acme threaded rods onto the traveling plate. Now these little spacers help get the alignment right, but before I tighten down the nuts, I actually like to have a screw running through both of them just to help with the alignment. And after I'm finished, that whole assembly should be swinging freely around that threaded rod. If that's not happening, you have a misalignment, loosen them both up and try again until it really is moving without any resistance. Now to finish this off, put a carriage bolt through the back of the mounting plate, use this large spacer and tighten down with this hexagonal nut with lots of holes tapped into the sides. Just pick a hole at random for now to thread the handle in. We'll get this located exactly where we want it after the full install is finished. And I only showed you one side, but the other side is exactly the same, so now we're ready to get these things installed. And that really just comes to driving 2 to 2.5 inch long number 10 flathead screws through the small countersunk holes in the mounting plate that we drilled pilot holes for in the first step. I didn't include these just thinking that they're such a common thing, probably everyone has them. I hope that's the case. If it's not, leave a comment that you're angry at me, and maybe somebody buying it in the future will benefit. Now you will find when you get to the 4 holes closer to the center of the bench, it's only possible to get screws into 2 or maybe 3 of these because the pivot bars are in the way. That's by design. There's 2 or 3 that are accessible in any Vise configuration, and that's plenty. There's not actually that much force on the plate at this point, so just drive screws into the ones you can and don't worry about the other ones. Also, in case you're curious, the reason that these holes in the center are just standard countersunk holes and the other ones that you're driving screws into are slots, that's because this is taking into account you might have some shrinking, contracting, seasonal change with the wood. So it's anchored as close as it can be to the center, and the other slots allow for some travel while still keeping all the hardware for the screws and the vise in the same place. And that's why these pivot mounts take the place of any kind of wood movement compensation system that you might buy from me or rig up yourself. I wanted to take care of it with this also, and that's how that's achieved. And don't forget the 2 screws right next to the carriage bolt. These are probably the 2 most important because this is where all of the force is taking place on that mounting plate because it all goes through the carriage bolt. So make sure you don't forget those, and you might find it useful to take off the hexagonal nut and the large spacer in order to get to these. Now we can wrap it up, put the nut and tightening handle back on, put the vise in, and see how it's working. And as a last step, you can position the handle in any of the threaded holes on the hexagonal nut so that you know exactly where the handle should be when the vise is tightened down. In this case, from your perspective, both pointed straight to the right. And that's it for the swivel mount install. Last thing to note is that before you tighten down on a workpiece, you should always have the 2 handles on the swivel mounts tightened down to avoid any kind of stress on the components. Thanks for following along.